What if I told you the United States government once spent millions of taxpayer dollars to study whether they could train dolphins to deliver secret messages during the Cold War? That's right, Operation Dolphin, a real-life project where scientists attempted to turn these intelligent marine mammals into underwater spies. And if that sounds too strange to be true, buckle up, because it's just the tip of the iceberg. Over the years, Uncle Sam has greenlit some of the most bizarre, hilarious, and downright baffling experiments you could possibly imagine. From mind control programs and psychic spies to radioactive breakfast cereal and weaponized bats. These aren't just urban legends or conspiracy theories. These are real, documented projects funded by your tax dollars, often with the straight-faced seriousness of national security. Some were born out of Cold War paranoia. Others were the result of scientists asking, but what if we tried this with absolutely no filter? And while a few of these experiments led to unexpected breakthroughs, many more collapsed into spectacular failures, leaving behind nothing but bewildered researchers, confused test subjects, and a paper trail that reads like science fiction. Today, we're diving into the 33 most ridiculous government experiments ever conducted on American soil. We'll explore the stories behind these wild projects, who approved them, what they were trying to achieve, and how things went so hilariously off the rails. Some will make you laugh, others might make you question everything, but one thing's for sure, by the end of this journey, you'll never look at government-funded science the same way again. So sit back, keep an open mind, and get ready to uncover the strangest secrets buried in the archives of American history. Trust me, you won't believe what they got away with. Picture a top-secret CIA program so controversial that even decades later, its full scope remains shrouded in mystery. MK Ultra wasn't just another Cold War experiment, it was a full-blown quest to weaponize the human mind. Launched in the 1950s, the project aimed to develop mind control techniques that could turn enemies into unwitting spies, erase memories, or even program assassins. And the methods anything but humane. Scientists dosed unsuspecting subjects, prisoners, mental patients, even ordinary citizens, with LSD and other hallucinogens, often without their knowledge. One notorious case involved a Kentucky doctor who gave LSD to his patients during supposed therapy sessions, leaving some permanently traumatized, the program's most shocking aspect. Its sheer scale, over 80 institutions, including universities and hospitals, were quietly recruited to conduct experiments under the CIA's direction. Funding flowed through front organizations to keep the research off the books. Some tests involved sensory deprivation, hypnosis, or electroshock therapy. Others pushed further, like the Canadian psychiatrist who subjected patients to drug-induced comas and weeks of forced audio loops in an attempt to reprogram their personalities. When MK Ultra was finally exposed in the 1970s, the fallout was explosive. Congressional hearings revealed that the CIA had destroyed most of its records, leaving only fragments of the truth. Yet the legacy lingers not just in conspiracy theories but in pop culture. From Stranger Things to The Manchurian Candidate, MK Ultra's shadow looms large. And while the program officially ended, one haunting question remains: how much of this research simply went deeper underground? If you thought weaponized dolphins were strange, wait until you hear about the time the U.S. military tried to turn bats into living bombs. During World War II, as scientists scrambled to develop new weapons, a Pennsylvania dentist named Little Adams pitched an idea so outrageous it somehow got approved. Strap tiny incendiary devices to bats, release them over Japanese cities, and let the animals roost in flammable buildings before the timers ignited. The logic: bats could carry small payloads into hard-to-reach places, sparking thousands of uncontrolled fires across enemy territory, and thus Project X-Ray was born. The Army recruited zoologists to capture thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats, while engineers designed miniature napalm charges weighing less than an ounce. Tests began in secret with predictable chaos. In one infamous trial at Carlsbad Army Airfield, armed bats escaped during a demonstration, nesting under fuel tanks and setting the entire base ablaze. The resulting fire destroyed a general's car and several buildings, proof the concept worked, just not the way anyone intended. Despite the accidental success, the bat bomb faced hurdles. Delivering live bats required complicated refrigeration to keep them dormant during flights, and by 1944, the atomic bomb project stole both funding and urgency. The military quietly shelved Project X-ray, though not before spending $2 million, the equivalent of $30 million today, on what might be history's most unusual firestarter. And while the bats never saw combat, their legacy lives on in military folklore, a stark reminder that sometimes nature fights back. The Cold War wasn't just fought with satellites and spies, it also included battles waged inside the human mind. Enter the Stargate project, the Pentagon's $20 million gamble that psychic powers could outperform traditional intelligence gathering. From 1972 until the mid-90s, this secretive program trained so-called remote viewers to mentally project themselves across continents, describing hidden military bases, kidnapped hostages, even Soviet nuclear facilities, all while sitting in a dimly lit Virginia lab. One declassified case claimed stunning accuracy. In 1980, a viewer named Joe McMonagle allegedly pinpointed a secret Soviet submarine construction site by describing an unfamiliar hammer and sickle logo visible only inside the facility. Skeptics dismissed it as an educated guess, but believers pointed to eerily specific details, like correctly identifying a typhoon sheltering the sub, a fact later verified by satellite images. Another viewer reportedly located a downed plane in Africa with such precision that recovery teams found it within hours. Yet for every seeming success, there were glaring inconsistencies. Viewers often produced vague, dreamlike impressions prone to subjective interpretation. A CIA review later found that psychic intelligence never provided actionable data unavailable through conventional means. The final nail came in 1995, when the American Institutes for Research concluded remote viewing had no real intelligence value. The Pentagon shuttered Stargate, though rumors persist that fragments of the research migrated to black-budget projects. What makes Stargate fascinating isn't just the audacity of weaponizing clairvoyance, it's how seriously it was taken. The government funneled millions into studying phenomena science still can't explain, recruiting physicists and neuroscientists to analyze results. Declassified manuals reveal rigorous protocols, from blind targeting methods to control groups. In the end, the program didn't prove psychic powers existed, but it did prove how far desperation and Cold War paranoia could stretch the limits of rational thinking. The Acoustic Kitty might sound like a bad spy movie plot, but believe it or not, this was a real CIA operation from the golden age of Cold War absurdity. In the 1960s, the agency sank $20 million into a project that could only be described as part Frankenstein, part James Bond. They surgically implanted a cat with microphones, transmitters, and a battery pack, aiming to turn it into the world's first feline spy. The idea: deploy the wired-up cat near Soviet officials to eavesdrop on private conversations, capitalizing on the animal's natural ability to wander unnoticed. Of course, reality had other plans. The first major hurdle was the cat itself. Unlike trained dogs or even dolphins, cats proved stubbornly indifferent to commands. After months of conditioning, the best they could manage was getting the cat to sit still briefly. Then there was the issue of power. The bulky battery and antenna setup had to be embedded under the animal's skin, but keeping it charged required frequent surgeries, leaving the poor creature looking increasingly like a patchwork experiment. Then came the field test. Agents released the Acoustic Kitty near a park where two diplomats were chatting. Instead of slinking toward its targets as hoped, the cat immediately bolted into the street and was hit by a taxi. The project was quietly scrapped soon after, though not before one exasperated scientist reportedly summed it up: "You might as well tape a microphone to a rocking chair and push it down the street." What makes this experiment more than just a punchline is how perfectly it encapsulates Cold War desperation. The CIA wasn't just throwing money at science, they were throwing it at anything, no matter how outlandish, that might give them an edge. And while the Acoustic Kitty became a symbol of government waste, it also hinted at a darker truth. When secrecy outweighs accountability, even the most ludicrous ideas can become someone's taxpayer-funded reality. Decades later, declassified documents still redact key details, leaving us to wonder how many other half-brained animal experiments never saw the light of day. One thing's certain: if you ever spot a suspiciously well-dressed cat loitering near a government building, maybe, just maybe, keep your voice down. In 1950, the U.S. Navy turned the city of San Francisco into an unwitting lab rat in one of the most shocking biological experiments in American history. Operation Sea Spray was designed to test how a covert bioweapon attack might play out in a major coastal city, and the military's method was as chilling as it was simple. For 6 days, Navy ships stationed near the Golden Gate Bridge sprayed massive quantities of a supposedly harmless bacteria, Serratia marcescens, into the fog rolling over the city. The red pigmented microbes were chosen because they'd be easy to track, glowing under ultraviolet light as they spread through the air. What the Navy didn't anticipate: those same bacteria would leave a trail of real-world suffering in their wake. Within days, 11 residents checked into Stanford Hospital with severe urinary tract infections, all testing positive for Serratia, a strain rarely seen in the area. One patient, a retired pipefitter named Edward Nevin, developed a fatal heart infection linked directly to the bacteria. His family later sued the government, marking the first time civilians challenged the military's right to use populated areas as testing grounds. The Navy's defense: they claimed the bacteria were harmless, despite knowing Serratia could cause infections in vulnerable individuals. Documents later revealed they'd chosen San Francisco precisely because its cool, damp climate mimicked Soviet cities they feared might be targeted in a retaliatory strike. The fallout didn't end with lawsuits. In the 1970s, when the experiment finally came to light during congressional hearings, it exposed a terrifying pattern. Over 700,000 civilians had been exposed to biological agents in similar tests across the country, from New York subway riders inhaling airborne bacteria to Midwest farmers unknowingly subjected to fungal spores. Operation Sea Spray became a rallying cry for medical ethics reform, but the legal battles went nowhere. Courts ruled the government couldn't be held liable for acts deemed necessary to national security. What makes this experiment especially unsettling is how blatantly it treated human lives as collateral damage. No public warnings were issued, no medical follow-ups were conducted for those exposed. And while the military insisted the tests were defensive, meant to prepare for potential Soviet attacks, critics pointed out the grim irony. In their quest to simulate bioterrorism, they'd effectively become bioterrorists. Decades later, declassified memos still dodge accountability, referring to infected civilians as a statistically insignificant sample size. For the Nevin family and thousands like them, that statistical indifference came with a very human cost. Imagine being told you're receiving free health care, only to discover decades later you were actually part of one of the most grotesque medical betrayals in American history. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study wasn't just unethical, it was a 40-year-long atrocity disguised as science, where 600 black men in rural Alabama became unwitting test subjects in a horrifying experiment on untreated disease. Starting in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service recruited impoverished black sharecroppers under the guise of offering treatment for bad blood, a vague term locals associated with various ailments. What they didn't reveal, all participants had syphilis, and researchers intentionally withheld treatment even after penicillin became the standard cure in the 1940s. The racial dynamics were impossible to ignore. Researchers exclusively targeted Black communities, exploiting systemic poverty and limited healthcare access. They went to grotesque lengths to maintain the deception, providing placebos, scheduling useless spinal taps they called special treatment, and even preventing participants from receiving care elsewhere by collaborating with local doctors. When some men were drafted for World War II, the study intercepted their draft notices to stop military medics from treating their syphilis, all while the Public Health Service meticulously documented the disease's progression as men went blind, insane, or died from complications data they callously referred to as a rare opportunity. It took a whistleblower, Peter Buxton, to finally expose the study in 1972 after health officials ignored his repeated internal protests. Front-page newspaper reports sparked national outrage, forcing the government to shut it down, but not before 28 men had died directly from syphilis, 100 more from related complications, and at least 40 wives and 19 children infected through transmission. The fallout reshaped medical ethics forever. Congress passed laws requiring informed consent, created institutional review boards to oversee human research, and led to a presidential apology in 1997. Yet the damage ran deeper than policy changes. Tuskegee became synonymous with medical racism, fueling generations of Black Americans' distrust in healthcare systems, a wariness that echoes today in lower vaccination rates and reluctance toward preventative care. What began as a study rooted in white supremacist pseudoscience about racial differences in disease left wounds no apology could fully heal. The real tragedy isn't just that it happened, but that for 40 years nobody in power thought to stop it. During the darkest days of the Cold War, the U.S. government made ordinary citizens part of an invisible battlefield without their knowledge or consent. The human radiation experiments weren't a single study, but a sprawling, decades-long series of tests that exposed thousands of Americans to dangerous radiation, often under the guise of free healthcare or routine medical procedures. One particularly chilling case involved pregnant women at a Vanderbilt University clinic in the 1940s, told they were receiving vitamin cocktails to improve their baby's health. They were actually drinking radioactive iron-laced drinks so researchers could track how radiation passed to fetuses. Years later, follow-ups revealed several of those children had developed rare cancers at alarming rates. The scope of these experiments was staggering. Prisoners in Oregon and Washington had their testicles irradiated to study sterility effects. Hospital patients in Rochester, New York, were injected with plutonium to see how the body eliminated it, information the Manhattan Project desperately wanted for nuclear worker safety. Some of the most vulnerable populations became targets. Orphans fed radioactive oatmeal in Massachusetts, brain-damaged teenagers in Illinois given radioactive injections, even terminal cancer patients used as human guinea pigs to test how radiation spread through organs before autopsies. What makes these tests especially disturbing is the calculated deception. Documents later revealed military officials and scientists intentionally avoiding words like experiment or radiation in consent forms if they used forms at all. When families began noticing clusters of cancer and birth defects, the Atomic Energy Commission actively suppressed data, dismissing concerns as coincidence. It wasn't until journalist Eileen Wellsome exposed the plutonium injections in the 1990s that Congress finally investigated, uncovering over 4,000 radiation experiments conducted between 1944 and 1974. The justification: Cold War paranoia. With fears mounting over Soviet nuclear capabilities, researchers argued these tests were vital to understanding radiation's effects, whether for developing treatments after a nuclear attack or establishing safe exposure limits for workers in weapons programs. But critics pointed out the grotesque hypocrisy. While the government preached nuclear safety publicly, it was systematically risking civilians' lives behind closed doors. President Clinton's 1995 apology and compensation for some victims brought belated accountability, but key questions remain unanswered. Millions of pages are still classified, and many test subjects died never knowing what was done to them. These experiments didn't just cross ethical lines, they erased them entirely, proving how easily national security can become a license to betray the very people the government swore to protect. And perhaps most haunting of all, we'll likely never know the full human cost. The idea of pigeon-guided bombs sounds like something ripped from a surrealist cartoon, but during World War II, it was a genuine military proposal courtesy of none other than famed psychologist B.F. Skinner. Known for his groundbreaking work on behaviorism, Skinner believed he could harness the power of animal training to solve one of warfare's trickiest problems, precision bombing. His solution: equip missiles with live pigeons trained to peck at enemy targets, using their natural visual acuity to steer explosives with uncanny accuracy. Skinner's early tests were shockingly promising. He placed pigeons in tiny harnesses inside missile nose cones, where they faced a screen displaying real-time footage of the ground below. Using operant conditioning, rewarding them with food pellets for pecking at ship silhouettes, the birds quickly learned to recognize and strike targets with remarkable consistency. Even when researchers introduced distractions like smoke or moving landscapes, the pigeons adjusted their pecking to keep the crosshairs centered. Skinner boasted his feathered guidance system could outperform electronic alternatives of the era, with birds reacting faster than early mechanical computers. The military's reaction, however, was less enthusiastic. Officials at the National Defense Research Committee were skeptical from the start. One major sticking point: the sheer absurdity of entrusting million-dollar weaponry to creatures best known for scavenging city park crumbs. There were also practical hurdles: keeping pigeons alive during high-speed launches, ensuring they wouldn't freeze under combat stress, and explaining to Congress why taxpayer dollars were funding what one general reportedly called a barnyard bomb site. Yet the real death knell for Project Pigeon came from advancing technology. By the time Skinner refined his prototype, radar and gyroscopic systems were evolving rapidly, offering more reliable and less avian-dependent solutions. The program was shelved in 1944, though Skinner remained convinced his birds had been unfairly dismissed. In a twist of irony, decades later, the Pentagon would invest billions in drone technology that essentially automated what his pigeons had done organically: visually identify and track targets in real time. What makes Project Pigeon more than just a quirky footnote is what it reveals about innovation under pressure. Skinner's idea wasn't just whimsical, it was a testament to wartime desperation fueling outside-the-box thinking. And while the military ultimately preferred machines over beaks, the experiment left an enduring legacy in behavioral psychology. Today, researchers cite it as an early example of bioengineering, proving that sometimes the line between genius and madness isn't a clear one, it's a squawking, flapping gray area. Decades later, declassified sketches of the pigeon missile still surface, a bizarre reminder of how far scientists were willing to go when the stakes were highest. Perhaps the real lesson here isn't that the idea failed, but that in the right circumstances, even the wildest concepts can momentarily take flight. In December 1949, a secret military operation dubbed the Green Run sent radioactive clouds drifting over the farmlands of Washington state, not by accident, but by deliberate design. Conceived at the height of Cold War nuclear tensions, this controversial test involved releasing a controlled burst of radioactive iodine from the Hanford nuclear site to simulate how fallout might spread from a Soviet attack on American soil. What the military framed as urgent defense research came at a steep cost for unsuspecting civilians downwind. who would spend decades fighting for recognition of the health consequences unleashed that winter. The mechanics of Green Run were startling in their precision. Engineers vented nearly 8,000 curies of radioactive iodine into the atmosphere, equivalent to the iodine released by the Hiroshima bomb, while weather patterns carried the plume across 3 states. Ground crews then tracked the contamination using Geiger counters and air samplers, mapping how radiation settled on crops, livestock, and water supplies. But here's the twist: they intentionally skipped a critical safety step. Normally, nuclear fuel was cooled for weeks to reduce short-lived isotopes before such releases. For Green Run, they used fuel irradiated for just 16 days, maximizing the presence of iodine-131, a potent carcinogen known to accumulate in human thyroid glands. Farmers near Richland and Spokane began noticing strange patterns soon after: cows producing radioactive milk, children complaining of burning throats, clusters of miscarriages among pregnant livestock. Yet when locals asked questions, officials assured them the tests posed no danger. It wasn't until the 1980s, through investigative journalism and declassified documents, that the full truth emerged. The government had known about the risks all along. A 1950 memo from the Atomic Energy Commission even acknowledged the deliberately dirty nature of the test, stating it was necessary to obtain realistic data. The health toll became impossible to ignore. Thyroid cancer rates in exposed areas spiked dramatically, with one study estimating over 13,000 cases linked to Hanford's radiation releases. Families shared stories of multiple generations battling rare cancers, while ranchers described entire herds being condemned due to contamination. Legal battles stretched into the 21st century, with victims finally receiving compensation in 2004, 55 years after the fact. What makes Green Run stand apart from other nuclear tests isn't just the deception, but the chilling rationale behind it. Scientists weren't merely studying fallout physics. They were testing how a population might react to invisible contamination during wartime. The experiment treated rural communities as living laboratories, their suffering reduced today to points in classified reports. And while the government eventually admitted fault, the apology came too late for thousands who'd already paid the ultimate price for a secret they never agreed to keep. During World War II, as submarines patrolled the Atlantic and soldiers stormed beaches, the U.S. government decided one of the most pressing threats to national security wasn't enemy fire or espionage, it was sharks. The Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's wartime predecessor, launched a top-secret project to develop shark repellent, pouring resources into solving a problem that, statistically speaking, barely existed. Records show that out of the millions of sailors deployed during the war, fewer than a dozen had actually been killed by shark attacks. But in the fog of wartime paranoia, logic took a backseat to bureaucratic panic. The resulting product, dubbed Shark Chaser, was a bizarre cocktail of copper acetate and black dye, packed into wax cakes sailors could dissolve in water. The theory: the dye would create a visual smokescreen, while the acetate derived from the same chemical that makes vinegar pungent would irritate shark senses, driving them away. There was just one glaring flaw: nobody tested whether sharks actually cared. When field trials finally happened, the results were laughable. Sharks either ignored the repellent entirely or, in some cases, seemed mildly curious about the strange cloud in their water. One Navy report dryly noted that the dye might actually attract sharks by mimicking blood. What makes this experiment more than just a comedy of errors is how perfectly it captures the absurdity of wartime bureaucracy. While soldiers begged for better body armor or functioning radios, the OSS was funneling money into a solution searching for a problem. The project's lead researcher, a chemist named Kopp, even admitted later that the effort was likely motivated more by sailors' psychological fear of sharks than any real tactical need. In other words, it wasn't science, it was security theater with a side of chemistry. the Shark Chaser program dragged on for years, surviving long enough to be deployed in Vietnam before finally being discontinued in the 1970s. By then, millions of taxpayer dollars had been spent on a product that, at best, gave sailors a false sense of security and at worst might have acted as a shark dinner bell. Declassified memos reveal no evidence it ever saved a single life. This wasn't just wasted effort, it was a case study in how institutions prioritize perception over practicality. When bureaucracy loses touch with reality, even the most ridiculous ideas can gain momentum, propelled by paperwork and inertia. And while Shark Chaser may seem harmless compared to mind control or radiation tests, it's arguably more telling. After all, the mark of true absurdity isn't always malice sometimes. It's just a room full of people nodding along as someone suggests dye packets will outsmart nature's perfect predator. In the end, the only thing the program repelled was common sense, but perhaps its real legacy is as a cautionary tale. When fear drives policy, don't be surprised if you end up with a warehouse full of wax cakes and a very confused marine ecosystem. In the annals of military absurdity, few concepts provoke as much disbelief and outrage as the so-called gay bomb. Proposed in 1994 under a Pentagon program exploring non-lethal chemical weapons, this eyebrow-raising idea involved developing an airborne aphrodisiac designed to make enemy soldiers sexually irresistible to each other, theoretically causing mass distraction and disorder on the battlefield. The proposal, submitted by researchers at Ohio's Wright Laboratory, suggested flooding enemy trenches with pheromones or other chemicals to temporarily alter sexual orientation, turning combat zones into chaotic scenes of amorous confusion. The scientific community reacted with a mix of scorn and alarm. Biochemists pointed out glaring flaws. Human sexual attraction is far too complex to be chemically hijacked by a single compound, and no known pheromones reliably override personal orientation. The proposal also ignored basic battlefield realities. Would sexually frustrated soldiers really abandon their posts or just become more aggressive? LGBTQ advocacy groups, meanwhile, condemned the idea as both homophobic and dangerously reductive, reinforcing the stereotype that same-sex attraction was somehow inherently disruptive or comedic. The Human Rights Campaign called it a weaponization of bigotry, while military ethicists questioned how such a weapon could ever comply with international bans on chemical warfare. Declassified documents later revealed the proposal was one of many off-the-wall concepts brainstormed under a $75,000 exploratory grant. But what makes the gay bomb more than just a bureaucratic footnote is how starkly it exposes the military's willingness to entertain even the most dehumanizing ideas in the name of tactical advantage. The same documents show Pentagon officials seriously debating whether the weapon would violate the Geneva Convention's prohibition on weapons that cause undue suffering, not because of its psychological harm, but because it might be considered humiliating. Ultimately, the project was shelved, though not before earning an Ig Nobel Prize in 2007, a satirical award for science that first makes people laugh, then think. Yet the legacy lingers. For all its absurdity, the gay bomb speaks volumes about how fear and prejudice can warp innovation. When military strategists view queer identity as a weapon rather than a fundamental aspect of humanity, it reveals a mindset where even the most outlandish ideas get a hearing as long as they target the right enemies. And while this particular experiment faded into obscurity, it raises an unsettling question. What other equally bizarre proposals are still buried in classified files waiting for daylight? Perhaps the only thing more ridiculous than the concept itself is the fact that someone, somewhere, thought it was worth taxpayer dollars to explore. In the end, the gay bomb didn't just fail as science, it failed as strategy, as ethics, and most damningly as common sense. But in that failure, it gave us something far more valuable, a stark reminder that when desperation meets unchecked imagination, even the most ludicrous ideas can make it all the way to a Pentagon briefing room. On a frigid January afternoon in 1919, Boston's North End was shattered by a disaster so surreal it sounds like folklore. A 15-foot wave of molasses, thick as tar and moving at 35 miles per hour, obliterating buildings, drowning horses, and claiming 21 lives. The official explanation: a faulty storage tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company had burst under pressure, releasing 2.3 million gallons of sticky devastation. But dig deeper, and a far darker theory emerges, one that ties this bizarre tragedy to the U.S. government's frantic scramble to supply alcohol for World War I munitions and the shadowy beginnings of Prohibition-era corruption. At the time, molasses was more than just a sweetener. It was a key ingredient in industrial alcohol, used to manufacture everything from explosives to synthetic rubber. With the war raging, the federal government had quietly struck deals with distilleries to ramp up production, turning Boston's waterfront into a hub for munitions-related fermentation. The ill-fated tank, critics argue, wasn't just overloaded by accident. It was deliberately strained to meet military quotas, with inspections rushed or ignored entirely. Whistleblowers later testified that the tank had leaked from day one, oozing molasses down its sides like a weeping wound, but executives dismissed concerns, allegedly telling workers to paint over the cracks to hide the damage. The aftermath reeked of cover-up, though the disaster prompted one of America's first class action lawsuits, resulting in $600,000 in settlements. Key records vanished. Witnesses reported strange men in suits collecting debris before investigators arrived, and rumors swirled that tank fragments had been hastily melted down to destroy evidence. Most damning, the same week as the flood, Congress ratified the 18th Amendment, banning alcohol nationwide, a move some historians believe was accelerated to distract from the government's own role in the molasses crisis. After all, what better way to shift blame than to frame the alcohol industry as recklessly dangerous? The official story still blames poor construction and unseasonably warm temperatures for the tank's failure. But for those who peel back the layers, the Boston molasses flood looks less like an industrial accident and more like a catastrophic collision of greed, wartime pressure, and institutional secrecy. Even today, locals claim you can still smell molasses on hot summer days, a haunting reminder that some secrets, no matter how stubbornly buried, have a way of seeping back to the surface. In the shadowy corners of the FBI's declassified archives lies a case file so strange it reads like a rejected X-Files episode. The Bureau's very real, very earnest investigation into vampire sightings across rural America during the 1970s. While J. Edgar Hoover's G-men were famously hunting communists and organized crime, a lesser-known team found themselves chasing something far more supernatural: reports of blood-drinking creatures stalking the countryside. This wasn't some rogue agent's pet project either. Official memos show the FBI dedicated manpower and resources to analyzing vampire claims, complete with forensic assessments and interviews with self-proclaimed victims. The catalyst: a wave of panicked letters from small-town sheriffs and terrified citizens, particularly in the Appalachian region, where folklore already brimmed with tales of the undead. One 1973 report from Kentucky detailed livestock drained of blood, their carcasses marked by precise puncture wounds. Another from West Virginia described a pale, red-eyed figure seen lurking near graveyards before disappearing, faster than any human could move. Instead of dismissing these accounts as superstition, the Bureau treated them as potential criminal threats, assigning agents to scrutinize medical records, animal predation patterns, and even psychiatric evaluations of witnesses. What makes this investigation truly baffling isn't just the premise, it's the sheer bureaucratic seriousness applied to the supernatural. Forensic experts were pulled in to determine whether the wounds matched known animal attacks or humanoid dental patterns. One memo speculated whether the sightings could be linked to escaped convicts with hemophilia, while another floated the theory of mentally disturbed individuals engaging in ritualistic blood consumption. The files reveal no trace of irony, only methodical checkboxes crossed off in the hunt for something that, by all scientific standards, shouldn't exist. Critics later questioned whether the FBI was simply humoring rural constituents or genuinely concerned about unexplained violence. But the deeper context hints at Cold War paranoia seeping into unexpected places. With serial killers like the son of Sam dominating headlines and cults like the Manson family fresh in public memory, the line between myth and legitimate threat seemed blurrier than ever. If someone was murdering livestock or people under the guise of vampirism, didn't that warrant investigation? The case was quietly closed in 1975 with no vampires caught, no conspiracies uncovered. Yet the files remain, a curious relic of a time when even the world's most elite law enforcement agency couldn't resist peering into the darkness. Perhaps the real mystery isn't why they looked, but what else in their vaults might still be waiting for the right moonlit night to resurface. When the U.S. Air Force launched Project Blue Book in 1952, they framed it as a sober scientific effort to explain the surge of UFO sightings across America. But behind the scenes, declassified documents reveal a far messier truth. A program caught between Cold War paranoia, public hysteria, and the military's desperate attempts to control the narrative. Over 17 years, the project collected over 12,000 reports, from farmers spotting strange lights to pilots encountering objects that defied aeronautical physics. Officially, 700 of these cases remained unexplained even after rigorous analysis. The real mystery, however, wasn't just what people saw, it was why the government cared so much. At first glance, Blue Book seemed legitimate. Teams of scientists, including astrophysicist J. Allen Hynek, who started as a skeptic, applied statistical models and physics principles to each sighting. Some cases had mundane explanations, weather balloons, atmospheric phenomena, or Venus shining unusually bright. Others, like the 1952 Washington, D.C. flap where radar operators tracked unknown objects over the Capitol, resisted easy answers. Pilots reported crafts making 90-degree turns at impossible speeds or hovering without propulsion. Hynek himself grew increasingly troubled by the data, later admitting, "There was a residue of cases where the witnesses weren't crazy and the phenomena wasn't natural." But the deeper you dig into the project's archives, the clearer it becomes that science wasn't the sole priority. Memos from the Curtis LeMay era reveal a dual mandate: investigate sightings while actively debunking them to prevent mass panic. One manual instructed officers to attribute UFOs to temperature inversions or swamp gas, terms so vague they became punchlines. In 1966, when Michigan residents reported glowing objects near power lines, Hynek was pressured to blame marsh gases, sparking public ridicule. Critics accused the Air Force of treating citizens like idiots, while conspiracy theorists saw proof of a cover-up. The program's demise in 1969 only deepened suspicions. Officially, the government concluded UFOs posed no threat and held no technological value, yet leaked documents tell a different story. A 1952 CIA memo warned that continued secrecy risked creating a national psychology of hysteria, while a 1958 National Security Council briefing admitted some sightings involved technology not matching any known earthly developments. The timing of Blue Book's closure also raised eyebrows just months before Apollo 11's moon landing, an event watched by 500 million people. Was the Air Force stepping back from UFOs because they were irrelevant, or because space exploration made secrecy harder to maintain? What makes Blue Book significant isn't whether it proved aliens exist, it's how perfectly it encapsulates the era's tensions. Every unexplained radar blip became a Rorschach test. Scientists saw anomalies begging for study. The military saw potential Soviet psyops. The public saw either proof of extraterrestrials or proof their government thought they were gullible. And while the project's files gathered dust, its legacy lingers in modern Pentagon UFO task forces and congressional hearings, perhaps the most telling detail. After decades of dismissal, even NASA now admits we need better data on unidentified aerial phenomena. Turns out, the truth was never black and white, just varying shades of blue book gray. By far one of the most bizarre chapters in CIA assassination history, reads like a rejected Looney Tunes script: the repeated attempts to kill Fidel Castro using exploding cigars. During the height of Cold War tensions in the early 1960s, as the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, the CIA's Technical Services Division was busy dreaming up increasingly outlandish ways to eliminate the Cuban leader. Their plan: exploit Castro's legendary love of cigars by rigging them with enough explosives to, as one memo chillingly put it, remove his head from his shoulders. The logistics were as comical as they were disturbing. Agency engineers carefully hollowed out premium Cuban Coronas, packing them with nitroglycerin and tiny detonators designed to ignite when lit. The challenge: getting the doctored stogies into Castro's hands. At one point, the CIA recruited a German ex-mistress of Castro's as a courier, but the plan collapsed when she lost her access to him. Another scheme involved bribing a Havana casino owner to place the cigars in Castro's private humidor until the would-be accomplice got cold feet. What makes this farce truly surreal is how it escalated. When the cigars failed, the CIA's gadget lab pivoted to even wilder ideas. Poison pens filled with black widow venom, a diving suit contaminated with tuberculosis spores, even a seashell painted in bright colors and stuffed with explosives meant to lure Castro while he snorkeled. One particularly desperate proposal involved dusting Castro's shoes with thallium salts to make his beard fall out, theoretically undermining his macho image. Declassified documents later revealed the grim absurdity behind these plots. While the exploding cigars became the most infamous, they were just one entry in a catalog of over 600 documented assassination attempts against Castro. The Cuban leader himself seemed to relish the dark comedy, once quipping, "If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I'd win the gold medal." Beneath the surface, though, this wasn't just slapstick espionage. Each failed plot exposed the CIA's growing desperation as Castro outmaneuvered them politically and militarily. The agency's obsession with elaborate James Bond-style gadgets, rather than strategic subtlety, became a metaphor for American foreign policy's worst impulses: brash, theatrical, and ultimately ineffective. And while the cigars never blew up, the agency's credibility certainly did when these schemes came to light during 1975 Senate hearings. Historians still debate whether these attempts were genuine efforts or bureaucratic box-checking, a way for the CIA to show they were doing something about Cuba. Either way, the exploding cigars endure as a perfect symbol of Cold War folly. A moment when the world's most powerful intelligence agency thought the solution to geopolitics might literally be a stick of dynamite wrapped in tobacco leaves. The real punchline: Castro lived to 89, reportedly enjoying a good cigar right up until the end. The idea of a monkey controlling a robot with its thoughts might sound like science fiction, but in 2002, the U.S. Army made it a reality, sort of. In a lab at Duke University, scientists funded by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, wired a rhesus monkey's brain to a robotic arm 600 miles away. The goal: to create a system where soldiers could someday control drones or bomb-defusing robots using nothing but their minds. The monkey, named Aurora, was trained to move a joystick guiding a cursor on a screen. As she played, electrodes implanted in her motor cortex recorded neural activity. Then, in a breakthrough moment, researchers unplugged the joystick, and Aurora kept moving the cursor purely by thought, her brain signals now directly controlling the distant robot arm. On paper, it was a stunning success, but the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. For one, the ethics were murky at best. Aurora and other test monkeys underwent invasive brain surgeries, spending their lives in restraints while electrodes monitored their every neural flicker. Military documents framed the research as humanitarian, imagining paralyzed veterans controlling prosthetic limbs with their minds. Yet the same technology clearly had offensive potential. Imagine a squad of drones piloted telepathically, with no physical controls to hack or jam. DARPA's own reports openly discussed brain-machine interfaces for battlefield dominance, raising unsettling questions about where such research might lead. Then there's the practicality problem. While Aurora's feats made headlines, the system was wildly unreliable outside lab conditions. Brain signals are messy, easily scrambled by stress or fatigue. Early tests showed robotic arms jerking unpredictably when monkeys got distracted, hardly ideal for precise combat operations. Even the project's lead scientist, Miguel Nicoles, admitted mind-controlled robots were decades away from deployment. That didn't stop the military from pouring millions into the research, betting big on a future where telepathic tech might redefine warfare. Critics argued the whole endeavor was less about practical applications and more about keeping up with perceived advances by rival nations. Classified briefings from the era reveal Pentagon fears that China and Russia were investing heavily in similar brain-computer interfaces. In the race for next-gen weapons, no idea, no matter how far-fetched, could be left unexplored. The monkeys in this light were just stepping stones in a much larger game. What makes this experiment uniquely troubling isn't just the ethical lines it crossed, but the philosophical ones. If a soldier someday controls machinery with their mind, where does the human end and the weapon begin? The military's vision edges uncomfortably close to merging man and machine, raising dystopian questions about autonomy and consent. After all, if a monkey can't refuse a brain implant, what happens when the test subjects are humans? Declassified emails show officers casually discussing volunteer troops for future trials, as if wiring brains were no different than issuing standard gear. Years later, the research continues under different names, now focused more on human subjects. But Aurora's legacy remains a cautionary tale, a glimpse into a future where the boundaries of warfare blur in ways we're not remotely prepared to handle. The real breakthrough here wasn't technological. It was realizing how easily the pursuit of advantage can outpace our willingness to ask whether we should. And as for the monkeys, they got early retirements in a primate sanctuary. One can only wonder if their dreams still flicker with visions of robot arms moving at the speed of thought. In the early 1980s, while most Americans were debating tax cuts and Cold War tensions, an entirely different kind of controversy was boiling over, one involving ketchup, school cafeterias, and what exactly counts as a vegetable. Under pressure to slash budgets, the Reagan administration proposed a now infamous change to the National School Lunch Program, allowing ketchup and pickle relish to be classified as legitimate vegetable servings. The move would have saved millions by letting schools skimp on fresh produce, but it sparked immediate backlash from nutritionists, parents, and late-night comedians alike. How did this seemingly minor bureaucratic tweak become a symbol of government dysfunction? The policy's roots trace back to a perfect storm of fiscal austerity and agricultural lobbying. With school lunch funding on the chopping block, the Department of Agriculture faced pressure to cut costs without technically reducing nutritional value. Enter the ketchup loophole. Since tomato paste, a primary ketchup ingredient, already counted toward vegetable requirements under USDA guidelines, officials argued that a tablespoon of condiment could replace a half cup of actual veggies. Never mind that most commercial ketchup contained more high-fructose corn syrup than actual tomatoes. The proposal was a gift to processed food giants who stood to profit as schools swapped carrots and broccoli for cheaper, shelf-stable alternatives. Public outrage erupted faster than a shaken ketchup bottle. Editorial cartoons depicted Ronald Reagan force-feeding kids ketchup popsicles. The New York Times slammed the move as nutritional alchemy, while pediatricians warned it would exacerbate childhood obesity. But the most damning criticism came from within the government itself. A 1981 General Accounting Office report revealed that the USDA had ignored its own nutritionists' warnings, with one staffer quipping, "Next they'll say jelly beans qualify as fruit." The debate even reached Congress, where Democratic Representative George Brown famously held up a fast food ketchup packet during a hearing, asking if this was Reagan's idea of farm to table. Behind the absurdity lay a darker truth about America's tangled food policies. The same administration pushing ketchup as a veggie also slashed funding for school kitchen equipment, making it harder for cafeterias to prepare fresh meals. Meanwhile, agribusiness subsidies ensured that processed foods remained artificially cheap compared to whole produce. Critics argued this wasn't just about budget, it was about conditioning generations of kids to equate vegetables with sugary sauces, all while padding the profits of ketchup manufacturers. The irony: at the height of the Cold War, while the U.S. fretted over Soviet influence, their own school lunches were quietly shaping palates to prefer processed glop over real food. Facing overwhelming backlash, the USDA eventually backtracked, but the damage was done. The phrase "ketchup is a vegetable" became shorthand for political tone deafness, while school nutrition standards remained laughably lax for decades. As recently as 2011, pizza sauce still counted as a vegetable serving thanks to industry lobbying. What started as a budget trick revealed how deeply corporate interests could shape public health policy, and how easily bureaucracy could redefine reality with a stroke of a pen. Perhaps the real lesson here isn't about ketchup at all, but about the ways governments can manipulate language to serve narrow agendas. After all, if you can convince people that sugar-laced tomato goop is equivalent to a serving of vegetables, what else can you get them to swallow? The answer, as we've seen time and again, is almost anything. The ocean has always been the ultimate blind spot for military strategists, a vast, murky battlefield where technology often struggles to compete with nature's own designs. That's exactly why, in the 1960s, the U.S. Navy turned to one of the sea's most intelligent inhabitants, the bottlenose dolphin. Operation Dolphin, as it came to be known, wasn't some whimsical pet project. It was a multi-million-dollar effort to transform these marine mammals into living submarines, trained to detect underwater mines, locate lost equipment, and even guard nuclear assets from enemy divers. At first glance, the logic was sound. Dolphins possess a biological sonar system called echolocation, capable of detecting objects with pinpoint accuracy even in zero visibility. Navy researchers saw potential where machines faltered. A dolphin could distinguish between a rock and a mine based on density, or track a human swimmer by the faintest disturbance in the water. Training began in earnest at a secret facility in San Diego, where handlers used operant conditioning, rewarding the animals with fish to teach them complex tasks. Some learned to attach magnetic markers to suspicious objects. Others were trained to carry cameras or even drag incapacitated divers to safety. The program's most famous dolphin, a male named Tuffy, successfully located a lost hydrogen bomb off the coast of Spain in 1966, proving the concept had real-world value. But behind the success stories lay a growing ethical firestorm. Animal rights activists exposed the darker side of military dolphin training. Animals confined to small pens, subjected to stressful transport conditions, and sometimes fitted with harnesses that caused skin lesions. Whistleblowers described dolphins being worked to exhaustion or exposed to dangerous contaminants during open water tests. The Navy insisted the animals were well treated, but leaked documents revealed debates over whether the dolphins were truly volunteers or prisoners of war in all but name. Even the science faced scrutiny while dolphins excelled at finding objects. They occasionally refused commands or got distracted, hardly ideal for high-stakes missions. The program's legacy remains fiercely contested. Supporters point to life-saving applications like dolphins clearing mines during the Iraq War without a single casualty. Critics argue the same goals could now be achieved with drones and AI, rendering the exploitation of intelligent creatures unnecessary. Declassified files show the Navy quietly phased out most dolphin operations by the 2000s, though rumors persist of classified programs still utilizing marine mammals in undisclosed roles. What makes Operation Dolphin so haunting isn't just the ethical dilemmas, it's the unanswered questions about interspecies trust. These animals, capable of forming deep social bonds, were trained to assist in human conflicts they couldn't possibly understand. The most poignant moment might be a 1992 incident where a Navy dolphin named K-Dog repeatedly refused to mark a mock enemy diver during an exercise. Later, handlers realized the dolphin had recognized the enemy as a trainer he'd bonded with years earlier. Even in war games, it seemed loyalty sometimes trumped training. Today, the few surviving military dolphins live in retirement at marine sanctuaries, their classified missions fading into history. But their story forces us to grapple with an uncomfortable truth. In the race for tactical advantage, even the most brilliant minds, whether human or cetacean, can become collateral damage. And while the oceans may be safer without underwater mines, one has to wonder, were we ever worthy of the trust these creatures placed in us? If you think poultry and aerospace engineering don't mix, you've clearly never heard of the U.S. Army's legendary chicken gun, a 4-inch pneumatic cannon designed to fire whole, dead chickens at aircraft windshields at speeds topping 500 miles per hour. Born in the 1950s during the golden age of jet development, this bizarre contraption wasn't some military prank. It was a life-saving tool meant to simulate bird strikes, one of aviation's deadliest hazards. Engineers needed to know if cockpit glass could withstand a high-speed impact with, say, a seagull or a duck. And since real birds refused to fly into planes on command, the solution was simple: build a gun that could hurl their frozen carcasses with runway-level precision. The science behind the chicken gun was surprisingly sophisticated. Chickens were selected because their density and weight closely mimicked common bird threats. Testers would thaw the birds to body temperature for realistic squishiness before loading them into the cannon's barrel. Compressed nitrogen then launched them at windshields or engines, replicating the force of a mid-air collision. Early tests revealed shocking vulnerabilities, like the time a chicken punched straight through a prototype fighter jet canopy, proving the design needed serious reinforcement. Over decades, this absurd but effective method helped refine everything from commercial airliners to space shuttle components, saving countless lives in the process. What makes the chicken gun more than just an engineering curiosity is how it perfectly captures military problem solving. No nonsense, resourceful, and occasionally ridiculous. When critics question the cost, developers famously quipped, "It's cheaper than crashing a $50 million plane." The gun even became a rite of passage for new engineers who'd sneak in rubber chickens or frozen turkeys as jokes, until supervisors reminded them turkey bones could shatter expensive test models. Yet beneath the laughs lay serious innovation. Data from chicken gun tests led to breakthroughs like laminated glass that cracks without shattering and engine housings that deflect debris. Today, while simulations have replaced some physical tests, the gun's legacy lives on in every plane that survives a bird strike unharmed. It's a reminder that sometimes progress doesn't look like a gleaming lab, it looks like a frozen chicken soaring through the air at the speed of sound. The concept of a gun that kills without bullets, without noise, and without leaving a trace sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller. But during the height of the Cold War, it was very real. The CIA's so-called heart attack gun was one of the most chillingly efficient weapons ever dreamed up in the name of covert operations. This wasn't some theoretical blueprint gathering dust in a vault. Declassified documents confirm the device was actually built and tested. A tiny handheld weapon capable of firing a frozen dart laced with a toxin so precise it could induce a silent, untraceable cardiac arrest. The target would collapse, doctors would blame natural causes, and the assassin would vanish without a shred of evidence. What set this weapon apart wasn't just its lethality, but its sheer elegance in exploiting medical plausibility. The dart, no bigger than a grain of sand, would melt upon impact, leaving no puncture wound. The toxin, derived from shellfish poison or cobra venom depending on the iteration, would trigger immediate muscle paralysis, mimicking a sudden coronary event. Autopsies wouldn't flag foul play because the compounds broke down too rapidly to detect with 1970s technology. In one hypothetical scenario outlined in CIA memos, a foreign leader could be removed mid-speech, his death attributed to stress or poor health, while the actual shooter stood unnoticed in a crowd. The rationale behind such a weapon speaks volumes about Cold War paranoia. With global tensions at a boiling point, the U.S. needed deniable ways to eliminate threats without triggering all-out war. Bullets and bombs left obvious fingerprints, but a heart attack, that was nature's doing, or so anyone investigating would assume. The heart attack gun fit perfectly into an era of shadow warfare where plausible deniability was just as crucial as firepower. It wasn't about brute force, it was about surgical precision in destabilizing adversaries without leaving a trail. Yet for all its clinical efficiency, the heart attack gun raises disturbing ethical questions. If death could be delivered this quietly, this impersonally, what stopped governments from using it indiscriminately? Documents hint at strict protocols, only high-value targets, only under extreme circumstances, but history shows how easily such restraints erode when no one's watching. The weapon's very existence blurred the line between assassination and natural death, turning medicine into a weapon and physicians into unwitting accomplices. Even more unsettling is how plausible it remains today. While the original project was supposedly shelved, advances in biochemistry and nanotechnology could make modern versions even harder to detect. The heart attack gun wasn't just a relic of Cold War excess, it was a glimpse into a future where murder could be as invisible as a whisper, and perhaps the most haunting thought of all. We'll never know how many times, if ever, it was actually used. After all, the perfect assassination leaves no proof, just another name on a list of tragic, untimely deaths. Imagine a government agency so determined to undermine drug cartels that they decided to beat them at their own game by becoming drug dealers themselves. In the early 1980s, the Drug Enforcement Administration launched one of its most bizarre undercover operations, flooding the black market with counterfeit marijuana. Codenamed Operation Delta 9, the plan was audacious yet simple. Agents would manufacture tons of fake cannabis, lace it with an inactive chemical marker, then sell it through sting operations to unsuspecting dealers. The logic: tracking the marked product would help map trafficking routes, while inferior fake weed would erode trust in the illicit market. But like so many government experiments, the reality was far messier than the theory. The DA's fake pot wasn't just harmless parsley sprayed with food coloring, it was a carefully engineered product designed to mimic the real thing. Scientists at the agency's secret labs tested different herb blends before settling on a mixture of dried ginseng and other botanicals, treated with a non-toxic chemical tracer. The idea was that when the counterfeit cannabis reached its destination, law enforcement could scan seized shipments for the marker, theoretically leading them up the supply chain. At its peak, the operation produced over 1,000 pounds of this placebo pot each month, distributed through undercover agents posing as smugglers from Mexico to Miami. But here's where things unraveled. Instead of disrupting the drug trade, the DA inadvertently fueled it. dealers quickly realized the product was fake and simply resold it to less discerning buyers, often cutting it with real marijuana to stretch their supply. In some cases, they even rebranded it as a new strain, exploiting the placebo effect to turn a profit. Meanwhile, the chemical tracer failed spectacularly. Most of the counterfeit weed vanished into the black market's labyrinth, never to be detected again. Even when marked batches were recovered, the data proved useless. Traffickers moved product through too many hands for the DA to trace anything meaningful. Critics argued the operation was less about intelligence gathering and more about justifying the DA's ballooning budget during the Reagan-era war on drugs. Internal audits later revealed that the program cost taxpayers over $6 million, equivalent to nearly $20 million today, with no measurable impact on cartel operations. Some agents privately admitted the fake weed might have actually boosted demand for genuine product, as frustrated users sought out the real thing. The whole scheme collapsed under its own absurdity by the late 80s, though not before inspiring a generation of conspiracy theories about government drug tampering. What makes this experiment uniquely frustrating is how it exposes the contradictions of prohibition logic. By trying to control the black market, the DA became a participant in it, and a lousy one at that. The operation assumed drug networks were simple chains rather than adaptive networks, a miscalculation that's haunted narcotics policy for decades. Worse, it risked eroding public trust. If people couldn't tell whether their weed came from a cartel or Uncle Sam, why believe official warnings about drug dangers at all? In the end, Operation Delta 9 became a cautionary tale about unintended consequences. It wasn't a clever sting or even a harmless stunt. It was a multi-million-dollar lesson in how easily good intentions can backfire when they're built on flawed assumptions. And while the DA moved on to other strategies, one has to wonder, in the endless game of cat and mouse between law enforcement and the drug trade, who was really playing whom? When most people hear about flying saucers, their minds jump to little green men and interstellar travel. But the U.S. Air Force had its own very terrestrial version of UFOs in the works during the Cold War. Declassified blueprints reveal a series of top-secret disc-shaped aircraft prototypes, each one more bizarre than the last, as engineers scrambled to pioneer revolutionary new flight technologies. From the silver screen, worthy Avrocar to the enigmatic Project Silver Bug, these weren't sci-fi fantasies, they were real, taxpayer-funded attempts to outmaneuver Soviet air defenses with physics-defying designs. The most infamous of these saucers was the Avrocar, a joint U.S.-Canadian project resembling something straight out of a 1950s B-movie. Funded by the Air Force and developed by aviation giant Avro Canada, this disc-shaped craft was meant to hover like a helicopter but reach jet-like speeds, all while evading radar with its unconventional shape. Early wind tunnel tests showed promise, but reality quickly intruded. Pilots nicknamed it the Flying Flapjack for its tendency to wobble uncontrollably just a few feet off the ground. Declassified footage from 1959 shows engineers struggling to stabilize it during test flights, with the saucer lurching like a drunken dinner plate before skidding into the dirt. The military poured millions into troubleshooting before admitting defeat. The Avrocar couldn't even clear telephone poles without nearly flipping over, let alone revolutionize warfare. But the Avrocar was just the tip of the saucer-shaped iceberg. Behind the scenes, the Air Force was exploring even wilder concepts under Project Silver Bug. This black-budget effort aimed to create a nuclear-powered disc capable of vertical takeoff and Mach 3 speeds fast enough to outrun missiles. Sketches show sleek, metallic saucers with rotating outer rings, theoretically harnessing something called the Coanda effect to defy gravity. The science was speculative at best. One memo even admitted the design relied on principles not fully understood by current aerodynamics. Unsurprisingly, Silver Bug never left the drawing board, though rumors persist that elements of its research resurfaced in later stealth programs. So why the obsession with flying discs? Declassified strategy papers reveal a mix of desperation and ingenuity. Soviet radar systems were becoming alarmingly effective at tracking conventional aircraft, so the military gambled that a saucer's shape might scatter radar waves unpredictably. There was also the psychological factor. Imagine the panic if Soviet troops spotted a fleet of unidentified discs screaming across the sky. The problem: physics didn't cooperate. While discs excelled at hovering, their flat surfaces created catastrophic drag at high speeds. Engineers eventually conceded that saucers were aerodynamically the worst possible shape for sustained flight, a realization that grounded most projects by the mid-60s. Yet the legacy of these saucer programs lingers in unexpected ways. The Avrakar's failure directly influenced the development of the Harrier jump jet, proving that vertical takeoff required more than just bold ideas. And declassified CIA files confirmed Soviet scientists were pursuing their own saucer designs, suggesting the concept wasn't entirely outlandish, just ahead of its time. Today, drone prototypes with disc-like profiles hint at a possible revival, though modern engineers wisely avoid the nuclear-powered fantasies of the Cold War. The real takeaway here isn't that flying saucers were impossible, it's that they were a symptom of an era when fear and ambition collided in spectacular fashion. With a space race heating up and atomic paranoia at its peak, no idea seemed too strange if it might secure an edge over the Soviets. And while these saucers never soared as envisioned, they remain a fascinating footnote in aviation history, proof that when governments throw enough money at science fiction, sometimes the results are stranger than fiction itself. The story sounds like something out of a satirical tech blog, a top-secret national security agency facility relying on hamster wheels as a backup power source. According to leaked but unverified documents, buried deep in the NSA's budget reports from the late 1990s was a line item for what insiders allegedly called Project Whisker Watts, a contingency plan that involved housing hundreds of hamsters in a subterranean data center. If the power grid failed, these tiny rodents would supposedly keep America's surveillance machinery humming by running on specially reinforced wheels hooked up to micro-generators. On paper, it was a green energy solution. In reality, it was either a bureaucratic fever dream or the most bizarre example of government waste ever conceived. If true, the math alone makes this scheme laughable. Even under ideal conditions, a hamster generates roughly half a watt of power, meaning you'd need 2,000 hamsters sprinting non-stop just to power a single household refrigerator. Scaling that up to support a data center processing billions of encrypted communications would require millions of rodents, not to mention the logistical nightmare of feeding them, cleaning their enclosures, and preventing the kind of interspecies chaos that would make Snowpiercer look orderly. Yet the project supposedly secured funding under the guise of redundant, off-grid solutions, with contractors billing taxpayers for custom cages, veterinary oversight, and even mini treadmills to maximize rodent RPMs. What makes this tale so telling, whether factual or apocryphal, is how perfectly it mirrors the absurdity of unchecked defense spending. The NSA's budget has long been a black hole, with billions disappearing into unspecified, advanced initiatives and special accesses. In an era where the agency was building sprawling Utah data centers to store yottabytes of user data, the idea that someone greenlit a hamster-powered backup plan speaks to a culture where no idea is too outlandish if it comes wrapped in national security jargon. Critics of government waste latched onto the story as emblematic of a system that prioritizes whimsy over accountability, where innovation can mean anything from quantum decryption to literal wheel-running mammals. The NSA, naturally, has never confirmed the hamster scheme, dismissing it as an urban legend, but the story persists because it fits a pattern. This is the same agency that once spent $80 million on a doomed metadata program later deemed useless by auditors, and another 20 million attempting to predict global unrest by analyzing social media emoji usage. When you operate without real oversight, the line between cutting-edge research and slapstick comedy blurs fast. Whether Project Whisker Watts was real or just an inside joke that escaped the vault, its legend endures as a cautionary tale. In the shadowy world of intelligence budgets, where secrecy shields incompetence as often as it protects legitimate operations, sometimes the most absurd stories are the ones that reveal the most. After all, when you've got the power to classify your own failures, why wouldn't someone try to power the panopticon with pets? The real question isn't whether hamsters were ever part of the backup plan, it's how many other equally ridiculous ideas got funded without ever leaking to the public. And if history's any indication, we'll probably never know the half of it. Every so often, a government study comes along that makes you stop and ask what exactly were they thinking. Enter the FDA's infamous blushing tomato experiment, where researchers were handed $250,000 to answer a question most people never thought to ask: do tomatoes experience pain when we slice them? At first glance, this seems like the ultimate parody of bureaucratic waste, a headline tailor-made for late-night comedy roasts. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find a surprisingly tangled debate about plant sentience, ethics, and whether science sometimes loses sight of common sense. The premise was straightforward enough. Scientists wanted to explore whether tomatoes, and by extension other fruits and vegetables, exhibit stress responses akin to pain when damaged. Using advanced sensors, they measured electrical signals and chemical releases in tomato plants subjected to cuts, bruises, and even simulated insect attacks. The study's most talked about finding: tomatoes emitted faint electrical pulses when sliced, a reaction some researchers dramatically labeled as the plant equivalent of screaming. Cue the media frenzy, with headlines declaring everything from "salad is murder" to "FDA proves your salsa feels fear." But here's where things get complicated. While the study undeniably ventured into eyebrow-raising territory, it wasn't entirely without scientific merit. Plant neurobiology, though controversial, is a real field exploring how flora communicate and adapt to threats. Research has shown that some plants release distress chemicals to warn neighbors of predators, or even alter their growth patterns in response to sound vibrations. The tomato study, in theory, aimed to expand this frontier, except it did so by anthropomorphizing produce in ways that blurred the line between data and drama. Critics weren't just scoffing at the price tag, they were questioning the fundamental framing. Pain, by definition, requires a nervous system and consciousness, neither of which tomatoes possess. Even the study's own data admitted the signals were passive stress reactions, not evidence of suffering. Yet the FDA's press materials leaned heavily into loaded terms like plant pain, leaving the door wide open for misinterpretation. It was a classic case of science communication gone awry, where provocative language overshadowed the actual research. The backlash was swift and merciless. Taxpayer watchdog groups lambasted the grant as a symbol of government excess, while comedians had a field day imagining USDA inspectors whispering apologies to their lunch salads. Even fellow scientists rolled their eyes, pointing out that the same funds could have gone toward, say, food safety or malnutrition areas where the FDA's oversight actually impacts human lives. Yet beneath the ridicule lies a genuine tension in modern science. As research probes deeper into the mysteries of biology, we're forced to confront uncomfortable questions about where to draw lines. If a tomato's stress signals don't equate to pain, what about octopuses or AI systems that mimic distress? The study's real failure wasn't its ambition, it was its inability to articulate why this mattered beyond abstract curiosity. In the end, the blushing tomato study faded into obscurity, remembered less for its findings and more as a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that science doesn't exist in a vacuum, it operates in a world of limited resources and public trust. Sometimes the most important question isn't, can we study this, but should we? And when the answer involves $250,000 and a very confused tomato, maybe it's worth double-checking the receipt. You'd expect military training exercises to focus on real-world threats, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, maybe even foreign invasions. But in 2013, the U.S. Army took preparedness to a whole new level of surreal by incorporating zombies into official drills. Dubbed Operation Zombie Apocalypse, this unclassified training scenario had soldiers responding to a fictional outbreak of the undead, complete with mock hordes of ravenous ghouls and panicked civilians. At first glance, it seemed like a publicity stunt, a way to capitalize on pop culture's obsession with The Walking Dead. But the truth, this was a carefully calculated psychological experiment disguised as Hollywood theatrics. The military has long used unconventional scenarios to sharpen decision-making under stress. During the Cold War, troops trained for nuclear fallout by practicing with fake radiation detectors and imaginary mushroom clouds. In the 90s, urban warfare drills featured actors screaming in made-up languages to simulate foreign combat zones. Zombies, it turns out, are just the latest twist in this tradition. Psychologists working with the Pentagon found that undead narratives trigger primal fear, responses the same adrenaline spikes and tunnel vision soldiers experience in real combat. By replacing generic enemy forces with flesh-eating monsters, trainers could push recruits to think creatively under maximum stress, bypassing the desensitization that comes with routine drills. Critics weren't convinced. Veterans groups accused the Army of trivializing warfare, while media watchdogs called it a transparent recruitment ploy targeting younger demographics. Even some within the military questioned the optics. After all, how serious could an institution seem when its press releases included phrases like counter-ghoul tactics? But buried in the backlash was a startling revelation. The zombie drills weren't really about zombies at all. Declassified after-action reports revealed that the scenarios were meticulously designed to mimic actual bioterrorism threats. The zombie virus behaved like a weaponized hemorrhagic fever spreading rapidly, causing violent aggression and overwhelming medical infrastructure. Soldiers weren't learning to headshot the undead. They were practicing quarantine protocols, crowd control, and crisis communication under the guise of fighting monsters. The brilliance of this approach lies in its deniability. Had the Army openly drilled for, say, a smallpox attack, it might have sparked public panic or tipped off adversaries. But zombies, that's just harmless fun, until you realize the skills translate eerily well to real pandemics. Fast forward to 2020, and suddenly those silly drills didn't seem so hypothetical. Veterans of Operation Zombie Apocalypse reported feeling oddly prepared for COVID-era challenges, supply chain collapses, misinformation outbreaks, and the surreal experience of treating cities like contagion zones. What started as a viral marketing tactic complete with tongue-in-cheek social media posts became a case study in how narrative shapes readiness. The military didn't just borrow from pop culture, they weaponized its emotional resonance. Fear of zombies taps into something deeper than logic, our collective dread of the uncontrollable, the other, and in that sense the training was brutally effective. Whether facing a fictional horde or a very real virus, the lesson was the same. Survival depends on staying alert, adaptable, and just a little bit paranoid. So the next time you see soldiers practicing for the zombie apocalypse, look closer. The monsters might be fake, but the stakes, those couldn't be more real. Picture a CIA operative kneeling in a dimly lit room, holy water in one hand, a dog-eared script in the other, reciting Latin phrases to expel demons from a shivering foreign diplomat. This wasn't some rogue agent's spiritual crisis, it was cold, calculated psychological warfare. Declassified files from the 1970s reveal one of the agency's most surreal tactics. training operatives to stage exorcisms, complete with sputtering candles and choreographed levitations, all designed to manipulate targets into questioning their sanity or loyalty. The so-called exorcism manual wasn't some medieval relic. It was a modern tool of deception, blending ancient superstitions with cutting-edge mind games. The manual's pages read like a Hollywood horror script crossed with a KGB interrogation playbook. Agents were taught to exploit cultural vulnerabilities, targeting individuals from regions where belief in possession was widespread. A staged exorcism could achieve what torture couldn't, breaking a subject's will by convincing them they were literally under Satan's influence. One declassified case describes an Eastern European official who, after waking to find his hotel room rearranged and demonic whispers played through hidden speakers, became convinced he was cursed. Within days, he turned informant, desperate for cleansing. Another operation involved dosing a Cuban official with LSD before performing a mock exorcism, leaving him convinced his Marxist ideology was the work of the devil. The brilliance and horror of this tactic lay in its self-perpetuating power. Unlike traditional interrogation, which risks creating martyrs, staged supernatural encounters preyed on the target's own psyche. Once someone believed they were possessed, no amount of rational debriefing could undo that terror. The CIA banked on a simple truth: faith in the unseen can override even the most disciplined mind. And because the victims themselves often hid their possession out of shame or fear, the rumors spread organically, destabilizing entire networks as whispers of curses infected enemy ranks. But the real question isn't just how these operations worked, it's what they reveal about the blurred lines between religion and warfare. By weaponizing exorcism, the CIA wasn't just manipulating individuals, it was hijacking centuries of spiritual tradition and repurposing it as a tool of control. The manual explicitly advised agents to study local folklore, tailoring rituals to match regional myths. In Southeast Asia, that might mean invoking ancestral spirits. In Latin America, it meant cribbing from Catholic rites. This wasn't improvisation, it was cultural warfare at its most insidious, turning faith itself into a lever of coercion. Critics later argued these operations crossed an ethical line even by espionage standards. While the CIA defended them as non-lethal alternatives to physical torture, psychologists pointed out the lasting trauma inflicted on targets left believing they'd been touched by evil. Some operatives reportedly refused to participate, uneasy about the moral cost of exploiting something as intimate as spiritual terror. And then there's the unintended irony: in an era when the U.S. condemned Soviet brainwashing techniques, they were literally staging demonic interventions to achieve similar ends. What makes this experiment especially haunting today is how it foreshadowed modern misinformation tactics. The Exorcism Manual was in essence an early blueprint for gaslighting at scale, a way to weaponize doubt and supernatural dread long before deepfakes or social media algorithms. Its legacy lingers in the darker corners of psychological operations, where the line between reality and orchestrated delusion grows ever thinner. After all, if you can convince someone they're haunted by demons, what else can you make them believe? The answer, it seems, is anything, as long as you understand the shadows where fear takes root. Perhaps the only thing more disturbing than the manual's existence is how few records survive. Like the ghosts it conjured, much of this program remains shrouded in redactions and half-whispered accounts, but its message echoes clearly. In the clandestine world of spycraft, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bullet or a bug, it's the human mind's infinite capacity to scare itself. When you think of working dogs, bomb sniffers or narcotics detection might come to mind, but what about bees? In the early 2000s, the U.S. Department of Agriculture rolled out one of its most unexpectedly ingenious programs, training dogs to sniff out diseased beehives before entire colonies collapsed. The concept was as straightforward as it was brilliant. Honeybees, already under siege from mites, pesticides, and habitat loss, faced another invisible killer, American foul brood, a bacterial infection so devastating it can wipe out entire apiaries in weeks. Traditional detection methods required beekeepers to crack open hives and inspect individual combs, a labor-intensive process that often missed early infections. The USDA's solution, a Springer Spaniel named Toby, whose nose could detect the disease's unique scent signature from yards away. Toby wasn't just a novelty act, he was a meticulously trained biosensor. Handlers used positive reinforcement techniques, rewarding him with playtime every time he correctly identified infected hive samples. Within months, he could pinpoint foul brood with 97% accuracy, even identifying early-stage cases human inspectors routinely missed. His success paved the way for more dogs, including a German shepherd named Mick, who once alerted beekeepers to an outbreak just by sniffing the tires of a truck that had transported contaminated equipment. The program seemed like a rare win-win. Dogs got to work in open fields instead of stuffy airports, and beekeepers gained a non-invasive early warning system that could save thousands of dollars in lost hives. But behind the feel-good story lay some harsh realities. Training dogs like Toby required thousands of hours and specialized handlers, a luxury most small-scale beekeepers couldn't afford. The program's costs ballooned as the USDA struggled to scale up, with each new detection dog requiring 12 to 18 months of preparation. Worse, foul brood wasn't the only threat bees faced. While Toby could sniff out one disease, he couldn't detect varroa mites or pesticide exposure, leaving beekeepers with only a partial solution. Critics argued the resources would have been better spent breeding resistant bee strains or funding research into safer miticides. Perhaps the biggest irony, the dogs worked too well. Their sensitivity meant they sometimes flagged hives with trace amounts of bacteria that weren't yet clinically dangerous, leading to unnecessary hive burnings, the only known cure for foul brood. Beekeepers grew wary of false positives, and by 2015, the program had quietly downsized. Today, only a handful of bee-sniffing dogs remain in service, their role largely symbolic as scientists pivot to electronic e-noses and genetic testing for large-scale monitoring. What makes this experiment so fascinating isn't just its creativity, but its poignant lesson about quick fixes in complex ecosystems. The dogs were a triumph of outside-the-box thinking, proving animals could fill gaps even advanced tech couldn't. Yet they also highlighted an uncomfortable truth. In nature, there are rarely silver bullets, only trade-offs. For every hive Toby saved, countless others succumbed to problems no dog could sniff out. His legacy endures as a reminder that sometimes the most ingenious solutions are also the most fragile, undone by the very complexity they sought to simplify. The U.S. Navy isn't exactly known for dabbling in science fiction, except when it is. Buried in the patent archives, there exists a series of baffling, borderline surreal inventions filed by the Navy's own aerospace engineers, including a hybrid aerospace underwater craft that allegedly defies known physics. These aren't speculative thought experiments or fringe theories, but actual government patents for technologies that sound ripped straight from a UFO conspiracy forum: anti-gravity propulsion systems, inertial mass reduction devices, even a high-frequency gravitational wave generator that could, in theory, bend spacetime itself. The most infamous of these, patent US 10,144,532 describes a craft capable of flying equally well in air, water, and the vacuum of space without conventional propulsion. If that sounds impossible, you're not alone. Physicists worldwide raised eyebrows when these documents surfaced, calling them everything from ambitious to thermodynamically absurd. So why would the Navy publicly file patents for technology that seems to violate the laws of physics as we know them? The answer lies in a shadowy corner of military innovation where the line between genius and madness blurs. The patents stem from the work of Dr. Salvatore Pies, a Navy aerospace engineer whose research focuses on revolutionary technologies. Pies and his team argue these inventions aren't fantasy, but extensions of unproven yet theoretically plausible quantum physics. Specifically, the idea that manipulating electromagnetic fields could somehow reduce an object's inertial mass, making it easier to accelerate to extreme speeds. The patents reference obscure phenomena like quantum vacuum plasma and piezoelectricity-induced room temperature superconductivity, terms that sound impressive but remain firmly in the realm of hypothetical physics. Skeptics point out that none of these patents have been independently verified or replicated, and the Navy has never demonstrated a functioning prototype. But here's where it gets intriguing. The Pentagon has a long history of pursuing black-budget projects so advanced they're indistinguishable from magic until they're not. Stealth technology, hypersonic missiles, and even the internet itself were once dismissed as pipe dreams before becoming reality. Could these patents be the first breadcrumbs of a classified breakthrough? Declassified emails reveal Navy officials vigorously defending Pies' work, with one admiral warning that China and Russia were already pursuing similar tech and the U.S. couldn't afford to fall behind. Another document suggests the patents might be a form of strategic disinformation, a way to bait adversaries into wasting resources chasing dead ends. The most compelling clue comes from an unlikely source, the 2004 USS Nimitz UFO encounters, when Navy pilots reported tracking unidentified craft performing maneuvers that defied known aerodynamics: sudden stops, instantaneous acceleration, no visible propulsion. Some researchers connected the dots. Could the Pies effect patents describe the very technology behind those UFOs? The timing is suspicious. Pies' filings surged just years after those incidents, as if the Navy were scrambling to formalize theoretical explanations for something they'd already witnessed. Yet without concrete proof, it's equally possible these patents are just bureaucratic artifacts, a quirk of the system that allows speculative ideas to be documented, even if they never leave the lab. What makes this saga uniquely fascinating isn't whether the technology works, but what it reveals about how innovation operates in the shadows. Patents like these exist in a twilight zone between science and science fiction, where the military hedges its bets by locking down radical ideas before anyone else can. Whether Pies' inventions are real or merely placeholders, they force us to confront an unsettling possibility: that somewhere in a classified facility, the rules of physics might already be bending in ways the public can't yet imagine. And if that's true, the real question isn't how these patents got filed, it's what else they're not telling us. When you think of the FBI's most pressing investigations, cryptozoology probably doesn't come to mind, but in 1977, the Bureau found itself knee-deep in the hunt for Bigfoot. It all started when a respected primatologist named Dr. Grover Krantz submitted a curious evidence package to the FBI's lab in Washington, D.C. Inside were strands of coarse, dark hair, allegedly collected from a tree where a Washington state logger swore he'd encountered the legendary creature. Krantz, a serious scientist with degrees from Ivy League universities, wasn't some fringe believer. He genuinely thought these hairs might belong to an undiscovered primate. And shockingly, the FBI agreed to analyze them. The Bureau's involvement wasn't just a courtesy. Agents treated the request with surprising gravity, assigning forensic specialists and even documenting the investigation in official memos. Using cutting-edge microscopy and protein analysis, they compared the hairs to known species: bears, gorillas, even human samples. The final report, declassified decades later, was a masterclass in bureaucratic deadpan. The hairs matched nothing in their databases, but they also didn't prove the existence of Bigfoot. Translation: we have no idea what this is, but we're not signing off on Sasquatch. So why would the FBI, an agency more accustomed to hunting mobsters and spies, waste resources on a cryptid chase? The answer lies in Cold War-era paranoia. The 70s saw a surge in reports of unidentified creatures across rural America, some near sensitive military installations. One declassified memo hints at concerns that Soviet agents might be exploiting Bigfoot hysteria to spread disinformation or distract from real espionage. Another theory suggests the Bureau was quietly ruling out the possibility that these creature sightings were actually escaped lab animals or even biological experiments gone wrong. After all, if someone was illegally importing exotic primates that fell under federal jurisdiction, the real irony, while the FBI's analysis came up inconclusive modern DNA testing decades later, revealed the hairs likely belonged to an unusual but known species, a rare subspecies of North American bison. Turns out the truth was both more mundane and more fascinating than anyone expected. Yet the episode raises bigger questions about where the line between science and folklore blurs, and why even the most skeptical institutions sometimes find themselves chasing shadows. What makes this experiment so compelling isn't just the absurdity of federal agents scrutinizing Bigfoot hair. It's the realization that even the FBI isn't immune to the allure of the unexplained. In the end, the only thing they definitively proved was that when it comes to mysteries, sometimes the most official answer is still a shrug. The idea of teleportation has long been the stuff of science fiction, from Star Trek's transporter beams to superhero movies where characters blink in and out of existence. But what if I told you the Pentagon once seriously explored the possibility of instantaneous travel, not just across space but across time itself? Declassified documents from the early 2000s reveal a little-known Defense Intelligence Agency program that investigated jump rooms, alleged portals where soldiers could step through one location and emerge in another, bypassing the need for traditional transportation. And while this sounds like pure conspiracy fodder, the truth behind these reports is far stranger than any fiction. At the heart of this mystery was a secretive project linked to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. While the program's primary focus was investigating unidentified aerial phenomena, leaked files show a subset of research dedicated to anomalous teleportation events. One particularly eyebrow-raising memo detailed an alleged incident in which a Marine detachment in Afghanistan reported seeing a fellow soldier vanish during a patrol, only to reappear moments later claiming he'd been transported to a desert base in New Mexico thousands of miles away. The document's language is cautious, labeling the account anecdotal but worthy of further study, yet the fact that it was formally catalogued at all raises questions. Skeptics were quick to dismiss the story as battlefield hallucinations or stress-induced confusion, but the intrigue deepened when former program insiders came forward with claims that the military had been experimenting with non-linear physics since the Cold War. One aerospace contractor, speaking anonymously, described prototype jump chambers built using theories borrowed from quantum entanglement research. The idea was that if particles could be linked across distances, perhaps human consciousness or even physical matter could too. Documents reference classified experiments where subjects reportedly experienced temporal dislocation, describing visions of past and future events during controlled tests. Of course, separating fact from speculation here is like untangling a ball of quantum strings. The Pentagon has never confirmed operational teleportation technology, and most physicists argue the energy requirements alone make it impossible with current science. Yet the persistence of these reports across decades and from seemingly credible witnesses suggests something more than mere fantasy. Could these jump room accounts be garbled retellings of advanced hologram or drone tests, misinterpreted psychological operations meant to disorient enemies? Or is there a kernel of truth buried beneath layers of classification and myth? One tantalizing clue comes from an unlikely source, the U.S. Patent Office. In 2018, a Navy engineer named Salvatore Pies filed a patent for a hybrid aerospace underwater craft that claimed to manipulate space-time itself using electromagnetic fields. While mainstream science dismissed it as impractical, the patent was officially approved, with backing from Naval Aviation Enterprise. If even a fraction of this research was real, it implies the military was exploring concepts so radical they blurred the line between physics and fiction. The most compelling argument against time-traveling spies, though, isn't scientific, it's practical. If such technology existed, why hasn't it transformed warfare? Why no time-altering assassinations or port-8 troops deployed behind enemy lines? The likeliest explanation is that these reports reflect the outer edges of theoretical research, where wild ideas get chased down until they collide with reality's walls. But in the shadowy world of defense contracting, where budgets depend on selling the next big breakthrough, sometimes the line between impossible and classified is thinner than we think. What remains undeniable is the military's enduring fascination with breaking the rules of conventional physics. From teleportation to anti-gravity, history shows that where national security is concerned, no idea is too far-fetched to at least get a file folder. So the next time someone scoffs at tales of government time travelers, remember, the truth might not be out there. It might just be waiting in a vault stamped top secret and smelling faintly of ozone. Imagine the U.S. government not just tracking hurricanes but trying to punch them into submission. That's exactly what happened during Project Storm Fury, the CIA and Navy's audacious 20-year quest to control the weather. Launched in 1962, this wasn't just about studying storms. It was an all-out assault on nature itself, with scientists dropping silver iodide into hurricanes in a desperate bid to weaken them. The logic: seeding clouds might disrupt a storm's structure, sapping its power before it could slam into the coastline. And for a brief moment, it seemed to work until researchers realized they'd been fooled by one of nature's oldest tricks. The project's most infamous target was Hurricane Debbie in 1969. After aircraft bombarded the storm with hundreds of canisters of silver iodide, its winds dropped by 30%, a staggering success that made headlines worldwide. But the celebration was short-lived. Later analysis revealed Debbie had likely been weakening naturally, a common fluctuation in hurricane behavior. Even worse, subsequent attempts to replicate the results failed spectacularly. Hurricane Ginger in 1971 didn't just ignore the seeding, it intensified, as if mocking humanity's arrogance. Scientists soon discovered a critical flaw. Many hurricanes lack the supercooled water necessary for cloud seeding to work, rendering their efforts as useless as shouting at the wind. What makes Storm Fury more than just a scientific flop is the recklessness it exposed. By the 70s, researchers began suspecting their interventions might actually be making storms more unpredictable. One declassified memo warned that tampering with a hurricane's eye wall could redirect its path, potentially steering it toward populated areas that would have otherwise been spared. The legal implications were staggering. If a seeded hurricane hit Miami instead of veering harmlessly out to sea, could the government be sued for billions in damages? Officials quietly shelved Storm Fury in the 80s, but not before leaving behind a legacy of unnerving questions about humanity's right to play weather god. The project's collapse didn't just mark the end of hurricane tinkering. It revealed a deeper tension between ambition and hubris. Today, as climate change fuels stronger storms, some scientists argue we're still repeating Storm Fury's mistakes, just with newer tools. Cloud brightening, ocean barrier proposals, even plans to blast hurricanes with lasers all carry the same unspoken risk. In our desperation to control nature, we might accidentally break something we can't fix. And that's the real lesson lurking in Storm Fury's stormy past sometimes. The most dangerous delusion isn't thinking we can't change the weather, but believing we understand it well enough to try. The human brain has always been the ultimate black box, an intricate web of neurons and impulses that even science struggles to fully decipher. But what if the military could crack that code? Enter DARPA Next Generation Non-Surgical Neurotechnology program, where researchers set out to build helmets capable of reading soldiers' thoughts on the battlefield. Forget clunky joysticks or voice commands. These prototypes promise direct brain-to-machine interfaces, allowing troops to control drones, navigate systems, or even communicate telepathically just by thinking. At first glance, it sounds like the stuff of comic books until you see the footage of a paralyzed veteran sipping coffee using a robotic arm guided entirely by neural impulses. That's the promise, the reality, a minefield of ethical dilemmas and technical hurdles lurking beneath the sci-fi sheen. The science hinges on something called electroencephalography, or EEG, a way to measure the brain's electrical activity through sensors placed on the scalp. Early versions of these helmets look like high-tech bike gear, studded with electrodes that pick up neural patterns associated with specific commands. Want to zoom a drone's camera? Just imagine the action, and machine learning algorithms translate that mental signal into code. In lab tests, subjects have piloted virtual fighter jets and typed words without lifting a finger. The military's vision takes this further, squads silently coordinating via synthetic telepathy, or pilots maneuvering jets at the speed of thought. One declassified demo even showed a soldier controlling 3 drones simultaneously while navigating an obstacle course, all with his mind. But for every breakthrough, there's a catch. EEG signals are notoriously messy, prone to interference from sweat, movement, or even the user's own heartbeat. Current prototypes require meticulous calibration, meaning a helmet that works flawlessly in a lab might glitch amid the chaos of real combat. Then there's the brain hack problem. If enemies intercept neural data, could they weaponize it? Researchers admit that malicious algorithms might one day inject false commands, turning a mind-controlled drone against its own team. And what happens when a soldier's private thoughts, fear, hesitation, trauma leak into the system? The Pentagon insists neural data would be heavily encrypted, but cybersecurity experts aren't convinced. After all, if hospitals and pipelines can be hacked, why not a brainwave database? The ethical quagmire runs even deeper. These helmets blur the line between tool and extension of self, raising unsettling questions about agency and consent. Could a soldier refuse neural upgrades without jeopardizing their career? Would commanders pressure troops to undergo untested enhancements for unit readiness? Legal scholars point to precedents like the Vietnam-era use of stimulants, where soldiers had little say over chemical interventions. And if the tech evolves to interpret emotions, say detecting panic or dissent, does that open the door to thought policing? DARPA maintains strict guidelines, but history shows how quickly wartime expediency erodes safeguards. Perhaps the most haunting unknown is the long-term effect on the human brain itself. Early studies suggest prolonged neural interfacing might rewire cognition, potentially dulling natural reflexes or creating dependency. One Air Force report fretted over cognitive atrophy, the risk that outsourced thinking could erode strategic instincts honed over millennia. Then there's the philosophical sting. If warfare becomes as effortless as imagining destruction, does that make violence too easy? A Rand Corporation analyst put it bluntly. We're flirting with a future where killing feels like a daydream. Yet for all the dystopian pitfalls, the potential to restore agency is equally staggering. The same tech that could turn soldiers into cyborgs is already helping paralyzed veterans walk again via exoskeletons. Civilian applications range from helping stroke victims speak to letting designers sculpt 3D models with their imaginations. The helmets in this light aren't just weapons, they're bridges to a world where disability doesn't mean limitation. DARPA Gamble forces us to confront a fundamental tension. The same tool that could democratize ability might also militarize the mind. As one scientist quipped during a congressional briefing, we're not building Iron Man suits. We're building the thoughts that wear them. And in that paradox lies the real challenge, not just engineering brains to control machines, but ensuring humanity retains control over itself. Because once this genie's out of the helmet, there's no telling whose thoughts will steer it next. You'd think studying the gambling habits of fish would be the punchline to a bad joke, but for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, it was just another line item in the budget. In the late 1990s, the USDA greenlit a $300,000 study to determine whether Siamese fighting fish could develop gambling addictions. That's right, researchers spent taxpayer money to find out if fish could get hooked on games of chance, complete with tiny aquatic betting scenarios. The premise sounds like a rejected pitch for a Pixar short, but the implications reveal something far more unsettling about how governments justify questionable spending. At first glance, the study's design was almost comically absurd. Scientists set up a system where the fish could choose between two different colored lights. One reliably delivered food, while the other offered a higher risk, higher reward payout, mimicking a slot machine's sporadic rewards. The goal, to see if the fish, like humans, would chase unpredictable wins despite the cost. And believe it or not, the fish did exhibit something resembling gambling behavior, preferring the risky option even when it meant less food overall. The researchers proudly published their findings, arguing it could shed light on the evolutionary roots of addiction. What they didn't address was why taxpayers should foot the bill for a project that felt more like a stoner's thought experiment than serious science. Critics pounced faster than a hungry fish on a pellet. Editorial cartoons depicted bureaucrats blowing cash on underwater casinos, while watchdog groups flagged the study as a prime example of grant systems gone rogue. The USDA defended it as basic research with potential human applications, but even fellow scientists scoffed. One behavioral economist quipped, "Next they'll be teaching goldfish to play blackjack to fund the deficit." The real kicker, similar studies on human gambling addiction were chronically underfunded at the time, leaving many to wonder why the government prioritized fish over, say, veterans or low-income communities struggling with real-world gambling crises. Dig deeper, though, and this fish tale exposes a darker truth about how federal grants work. The study wasn't just random waste, it was a symptom of a system that rewards novelty over practicality. Researchers often chase obscure topics because they're easier to publish, and agencies like the USDA distribute funds based on bureaucratic checkboxes, not real-world impact. A $300,000 price tag might seem small in a multi-trillion-dollar budget, but multiply that by dozens of equally questionable projects, and suddenly you're talking real money. It's the old death by 1,000 paper cuts scenario, where no single expense seems outrageous until you stack them all together. The irony, the study's actual findings were arguably less ridiculous than the backlash suggested. Understanding risk-taking in even simple organisms could inform addiction research if paired with meaningful follow-up, but that's the catch. These projects rarely get the sustained funding needed to translate niche results into actionable science. Instead, they become footnotes in academic journals, their only legacy a meme-worthy headline and another log on the public's cynicism about government spending. In the end, the fighting fish study became a symbol of something bigger. The absurd lengths institutions will go to justify their existence, even when the connection to actual human benefit is thinner than aquarium glass. And while the fish may have moved on to greener or riskier pastures, taxpayers are left with a nagging question. If this is how we're spending our money, what other underwater boondoggles are lurking beneath the surface? From weaponized dolphins to mind-reading helmets, the U.S. government's most bizarre experiments read like a mad scientist's scrapbook, except these were real, taxpayer-funded ventures that blurred the line between ambition and absurdity. Whether it was the CIA's exploding cigars or the military's bat bomb fiasco, these projects shared a common thread: a mix of Cold War paranoia, unchecked curiosity, and jaw-dropping waste. Imagine millions funneled into training pigeons to guide missiles or staging fake exorcisms to break enemy spies, only for the results to range from darkly comedic to downright dystopian. The financial cost alone is staggering. Adjusted for inflation, projects like MK Ultra and Operation Acoustic Kitty burned through hundreds of millions in today's dollars, often with nothing to show but declassified memos and public ridicule. Yet the true price wasn't just monetary. Many experiments crossed glaring ethical lines, from radiation tests on unwitting civilians to the Tuskegee syphilis study's monstrous betrayal of trust. These weren't just failed ideas, they were reckless gambles with human lives, justified under the flimsy banner of national security. But amid the outrage, there's undeniable dark humor in the sheer audacity of it all. The Pentagon's gay bomb proposal or the USDA's gambling addicted fish study prove that even the most serious institutions aren't immune to flights of bureaucratic lunacy. It's a reminder that history isn't just shaped by grand strategies, it's also littered with the debris of half-baked schemes that sounded genius in a briefing room but collapsed under the weight of reality. So which experiment takes the crown for you? Was it the psychic spies of Project Stargate or the Frankenstein-esque Acoustic Kitty? Drop your pick in the comments, and if you're craving more offbeat history, hit subscribe. Because when it comes to government experiments, the line between science fiction and sobering fact is often thinner than a CIA operative's conscience.